Okay, this video is for anybody that's never done wheel throwing before, or if you've done it before, you just need a bit of a refresher. Now, before you start, make sure that you tie your hair back. If your hair is very long, you don't want to get caught up in the wheel. You remove any jewelry that you have. If you have any, you don't want to get that damaged, put it somewhere safe. And while you're wheel throwing, it's a good idea to wear old clothes because it's very messy, or you can get an apron like this one, which is located in the storage room just beside the door. Okay, so what are the tools you're going to need? Well, first you need a container of water. You need some wooden tools. There's different shapes. I kind of like a wedge shape. I'll show you why later. You're going to need a needle tool, a sponge, and a couple of rib tools. This is a wooden rib tool and a metal rib tool. They're called rib tools because they used to be made out of an animal rib to get a nice curve shape, but now they just make them out of wood, metal, or silicone. Okay, now the wheel has an on switch down here. Okay, and it can go in both directions, so it can go clockwise or counterclockwise. This is your speed lever, which can also be controlled by your foot. That's full speed. Or it's got a little knob here, you can control it with your hands. I like using my foot because you're gonna have your hands are gonna be kind of busy. It's also a good idea to have a wooden board nearby, just so that if you make something you want to keep, you can take it off the wheel and put it onto here. As well as having a piece of wire, and we use this to actually cut the piece from the wheel so that we can lift it off. I'll show you how to do that. Okay, here's the clay that I'm using. It's rather large. I would start smaller if it's the first time you've done this. Start with a piece that's maybe about the size of 2 of your fists. Now, what I'm going to do to make it stick onto the wheel, I really have to slam it down. And I'm going to try to get it close to the center as possible. Like that. That's pretty good. Now you also want to make sure that the water doesn't get underneath the clay, because if it does, your clay will fly off the wheel. We don't want that. We want it to stick. So what I like to do is just sort of close up this corner, make sure it's well sealed. Just like that. Okay, the first step in the process is centering. And it's the same for whatever you're making. You want to center the clay first, and then you want to pull it up in a cylinder shape, and then you can shape it however you want after that. So no matter what you're making, you do have to center the clay, and this is probably the hardest part. So I'm going to turn this on. Now I'm right-handed, so I want the wheel turning in a counterclockwise direction, so towards and into my left hand, because that's what I'm going to use to center this clay. If I was left-handed, it would be the other way around. Now, to change the direction of the wheel, you turn it off, wait for that click, and then you flick the switch the other way. Now you can see it turning in a clockwise direction. So if you're left-handed, clockwise. If you're right-handed, counterclockwise. Okay, there we go. Now to center, you want a lot of speed. So I'm gonna go full speed here. And I'm gonna put some water on it. Now you need the water because you want it to be very slippery. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm pushing with my left hand against the clay, and it's going to conform to my hand and to the pressure that I'm applying. So what I'm doing is I'm pushing with my left hand, and if you can imagine a line from your elbow to your wrist right through to the center of the clay, you're applying pressure like this. It's not like this or like this. See how this line is going over here. You want this line to be in the center. Now, I've also got my elbow locked in to my leg. This is really important because you have to apply a lot of pressure here. And I'm also using this tray here. I'm resting my arm against the tray. That gives me a little bit more stability. You don't have to do that, and I wouldn't recommend leaning hard on this tray because it's plastic and you don't want to break it, but just to keep your arm stable, it's a good idea. Now, some people have a really hard time with this. What you can do is really lock your elbow in tight and lean your body over top of your elbow, and that way your arm will have more stability. Let me show you what it looks like if it's not centered. So if I'm off center, my hand's going to be moving around back and forth, and there's no way I'll be able to make anything with even walls if I'm off center, right? So if you see my hand moving back and forth, that means it's not centered. So I'm going to apply a little more water. As soon as you feel the clay drying out, add a little more water. So I'm applying pressure, and you'll see the clay start to cone up. That's natural, that's kind of what you want. Now your right hand can also apply pressure, but the majority of the pressure is happening with your left hand. Once it cones up like this, then we want to push it down, and we're going to push it down with the right hand. And there's different ways to do this. I actually like pushing with this part of my hand here because I can lock it against my other hand and still apply that pressure with the left so that it stays centered. Now I'm leaning right over top of my hands. My head is straight above this piece of clay, right over the center. Okay. So that's pretty good right there. Now, when I take my hands away, whenever you take your hands off the clay, you want to do it very slowly. If you do it too fast, you're going to go off center, and it's going to get all wobbly. So a little more water. You may have to do this a few times to get it centered. Coning it up, pushing it down, coning it up, pushing it down. I'll just do it one more time. Move your hands really slowly. Okay, I want to flatten this out a little bit. Now, your next step is to open it up. Now we're going to apply some pressure with our thumbs into the center. So again, there's different ways to do this as well. but you just want to start with a little depression and then put some water in it, because this will dry out quickly. Now sometimes I like to use 2 thumbs. Some people use 1 thumb. And how far down you go is kind of based on experience, really. Or if you really want to find out how far down you've gone, let's just soak up this water here. Use the pin tool. Now you can just stick the pin tool in here, and you can see that I've gone down. It's about 1 centimeter thick, probably a little bit too low. It's better to be maybe about 1.5 centimeters to 1 inch. We can always trim it down later. Like we can always trim the bottom of the pot to get rid of excess clay if your bottom is too thick. But it's better to go too thick than too thin. If you go too thin, the bottom of your clay can crack, and you can end up making a hole in the bottom. So you don't want to do that. So once I've got it opened up, don't worry about this hole. This will be covered up with clay, and it'll sort of heal itself. So what I'm going to do now is, now that I've gone down the center, I'm going to take my thumbs and I'm going to pull out this direction like this to open it up. All right, now I don't need as much speed, so maybe I'm going about half speed here, and I'm just pulling it apart. You can see I'm a little bit off center. It's a little bit wobbly. Okay. Just applying a little bit of pressure onto the bottom, flattening that out. All right, and now I've got what's sort of like a donut shape. Okay, and from here, I'm going to be pulling the walls up. So I am going to work on my right side, the right side of the pot, because I am right-handed. I'm working on this side, and the clay is now going through my hands. It's not going towards my hand like when I was centering. I'm now working on this side. And the action here is to squeeze your fingers together. So I'm using this finger and I'm just squeezing them together like this. Okay, and the clay is going to be moving upwards because I'm squeezing my fingers together. It's getting pushed up out of the way, and I'm going to slowly follow it up. Okay. It's good to have a lot of slurry on your hands, and make sure you've got a lot of water. And again, you can slow it down too at this stage. So I'm squeezing. You can start to see it move upwards. Now that's as much as I'm going to do for this first pass. It's going to take a little bit longer, a few more tries to get it higher. I've just noticed I've got a real big lump in here. You can probably see it. I'm just going to try to compress this down a little, try to get rid of that lump. Sometimes you can get an air bubble. Sometimes you just get an uneven piece of clay if you weren't centered enough, and I wasn't centered enough. Okay, now I'm going to do the second pull. Again, I'm going down to the bottom, squeezing my fingers together, and I'm just trying to go straight up. fact, I'm going to slow it down a little bit. Try one more time. Now, you don't want to go too thin, especially if it's your first time doing this. Yes, I've got a big depression in there. Now, if you go too thin, the clay walls will get quite weak and the whole thing can actually collapse on you. I'm actually working out a little bit. Ideally, you want to be working a little bit straighter, just going straight up. If you're making a bowl, if you want to make a bowl, actually you kind of do want to go out a little bit at an angle. It just means the clay will be stretched less when you're widening it out, depending on how wide you want to go. Now, I'm going to try to take care of this problem with this uneven rim here. You can do that with a piece of wire. We're going to try to cut it off. Oops. So I'm going to move the wheel here and I'm going to push it down to the lowest part of the rim. Just hold it, and that's going to cut off all that clay, just like that. Now we'll see if I'm a little more even. So add some water. It's a little more even. I think there's an air bubble in there, but sometimes you just have to go with it. Now, from here, if I wanted to decrease the size of this area, this rim, I can actually squeeze it in, change the shape that way. It's called collaring. I can also, if I wanted it sort of fluted outwards, now I can do that just by, using my fingers to adjust the shape here. Now, let's say I wanted sort of a wider bowl. I can go in and push on the outside just to change the shape. Now, it's also a good idea if you are making a bowl and if you want to stretch the clay quite a lot, before you do that, go in with the rib tool and just scrape all that slip or that wet clay off the edge or off the surface. And what that does is it strengthens that wall so that when you stretch it out, it won't collapse on you. Okay, so if I'm happy with this bowl shape, then I'm going to take my sponge and I'm going to compress the bottom. I want to remove all that water that's accumulated on the bottom. the bottom gets quite soft with all that water next to it or on it. And that can lead to cracking later on as the clay piece dries. Okay, so if I'm happy with that, I can turn off the wheel, and now I have to get, oh, before I do that, let's just trim this bottom corner. You're gonna have this shape like this, and that's just a lot of extra clay that we don't need. So I'm going to turn this on, and with some wooden tools, start scraping off that clay. Just holding your tool steady. Just take a little bit off at a time. Not going too fast here. Okay, and if I wanted sort of an undercut, I can use something that's a bit of a sharper angle, or actually that might be too sharp, but maybe I can use this rib tool. And just going right underneath there. Now I'll try this one. Okay. Now I'm going to take my wire, and I'm going to make sure it's pulled very tight, and I'm going to push it against the wheel and slide it under. Okay. Then I'm going to do it again. I'm going to dip it in water though this time to get some water underneath there. We'll just make it come off easier. So do this twice. And now you've got your board handy. You'll put it right here. And very carefully, you can use your hands or you can use the pot lifters to just pull it off and plop it down. You notice that I lost the shape there. That is actually okay. We can get it back. Move it a little bit like that. Give it a bit of a tap, and the shape will come back naturally. There we go. Okay, now you're going to put this outside, and it's going to dry out a little bit. We can't trim it yet because we want to actually trim underneath the bottom and give this pot a bit of a foot to it. But it's got to dry out a little. So I'm going to leave it outside overnight, and depending on the weather, it should be perfect the next day. Sometimes it'll dry out a little too much. Sometimes it won't dry out enough. Again, it depends on the thickness of the piece and the humidity in the air. So you just kind of have to keep checking it. You can turn it over, and that way the bottom will dry out faster. I'm not going to turn it over right now, but maybe, in a few hours or at the end of the day, I'll turn it over so that the bottom has a chance to dry out. Now, to clean up, this is the most important part. All of these big clay chunks, you want to scoop out of the tray. And you're going to throw that into the recycling bin. Okay, now we don't want any clay going down the sink. So any big chunks of clay that you happen to collect, you're going to put those into the recycling. If you're working on the wheel for a whole week, well, I would just expect you to wipe it all down after each use. Clean your tools, of course, because the tools get very messy, and we're trying to reduce the amount of dust that is in the room. At the end of your week on the wheel, I do expect you to take the tray off and clean the entire thing fully. But after each day, you can just take your sponge and give it a good wipe down. You can take your sponge and just soak up all of this water that's full of clay. Do not put this down the sink, okay? You're gonna put this into a bucket, and we're gonna allow that water to dry out, because any clay that goes down the sink, even if it's in this form, if it's just looks like water, you think that's fine. What happens is the clay actually settles, and it settles in the pipes, and you know how there's a little trap in the drainage pipe under the sink? All that clay gets trapped in there and clogs up the sink. So you can see I'm doing a pretty good job just using my sponge, just wiping everything down like this. Okay. Now, as far as your hands go, this again, the sponge is pretty dirty. Use some paper towel first, again, to take off the majority of all of this clay, and then you can just wash your hands. That's okay. But this, you wash your hands in the sink. This is going to go into the, we'll call it the slop bucket. That's just going to contain all the water and extra clay that you use when you're cleaning up. Check out, you know, the area around your wheel. You know, give that a little wipe down, especially this handle here. If your clay splattered a lot, if it got onto the wall, you know, take a rag, quick wipe will get rid of it really easily. The tools, you know, wash these out with the pot scrubbers. Yes, a little bit of clay will get in the sink when you do that, but I'd rather have these clean. When they dry out, you know, this is where the dust occurs. So, you know, you have dried clay, and once that starts to disintegrate, it ends up in the air and we end up breathing it. So we don't want that. So make sure your tools are very clean before you put them back onto the cart. And that's it. Oh, at the end of the week, if you're totally finished working on the wheel, you don't want to do it anymore, or you're moving on to something else, to take this apart, what you do is remove these little white clips like that. Okay. Those are the only things that are holding the two halves together. Give it a little wiggle, pull it right out, and then you can take this to the sink and clean it up fully. And, make sure you don't have the globs of clay getting in the sink. But you do want to, at the final cleanup, you want to clean all this out. Leave it on the counter to dry. Don't put it back on the wheel because the wheel will get rusty if you put this tray back on and it's all wet. The water will collect under here and this whole thing will get rusty. Make sure the sides of the wheel are clean, and the side again comes off like that. And you clean up this, and then you give it a little wipe down under here. There's usually clay underneath here that you want to clean up, and any clay around the wheel. Give the whole thing a good wipe down so that all that clay doesn't accumulate and the next person has a nice clean wheel to use. To put it back on, just put it down like this and slide it under the wheel. Okay, just again put it down in front of those bolts. See the bolts here? In front of the bolts, and slide it in. Then this side, press it against the base and slide that in. And then once these are clean, put it back together like that. And that is it. Okay, so it's the next day, and I'm going to show you how to trim the foot. So, why do we need a foot on here? And what is a foot? Well, a foot, if you look at this mug here, is this part right here, which is a little bit raised up off of the bottom of this cup. And the reason you need one is basically for stability. If you don't have a foot, you might put your pot or mug into the kiln, and what might happen is that this surface curves a little bit, so then you get a wobbly cup or bowl. We don't want that. If you have a foot on there, it's nice and stable and stays nice and firmly on the surface. So we do have to center this again. You can see it's not totally dry. It still has that clay color, and but it's not flexible anymore. So it's leather hard. It's at the leather hard stage. So I'm going to use these lines on the wheel just to try and center that as best that I can. And then I'm going to turn on the wheel to see how centered it is. So I'm going to spin it, and I'm going to use a loop tool like this, or you can use anything really. And I'm just going to hold it here, it's just against the side of my bowl, and I will notice that it's a little bit off center. So I'll go really slow and trying to hold this as still as possible to see where the gap is. Once I see that there's a gap, I can adjust this slightly, push it in. And just make sure that it's in the right spot. So I still have a bit of a gap here. I'm gonna push that way. So you make all these minor little adjustments. Eventually, you will be centered. So I think that's pretty good right there. So I'm gonna turn this off, and I'm gonna take an extra piece of clay, rip it into 3 little chunks, and then I'm gonna use this, and holding your bowl or whatever your piece is onto the wheel, press some clay into the side. Press kind of down. You don't want to press in. You might warp your bowl. So I'm going to do this 3 spots, and this is going to hold the bowl in place while I trim it. There we go. Okay, so let's turn this back on. And the first thing I want to do is, with this loop tool, I'm going to use this as a cutting edge. So I'm going to be holding this loop tool at about a 45-degree angle. And the first step is just to flatten out the bottom of your bowl. Sometimes you get ridges depending on how you've taken it off the wheel or how you've cut it off. So I'm holding my hand for stability. You don't want to be moving around. You want it very firmly in one spot. Okay, so the bottom is nice and flat. And I can use this opportunity as well to adjust the profile here. So I'm going at about, kind of slow speed. Don't try to do too much at once. It can really grab the tool and pull it in, and you'll create a big gouge in your bowl. So just a little bit at a time. You just have to be patient. Don't put too much pressure on it. You could end up just sort of tearing it right off the wheel as well. Put too much pressure. There's usually quite a bit of clay at this corner here. So don't be too afraid to take a lot of clay off. It will also reduce the weight of your bowl, which is important. I'm trying to get a consistent wall thickness from the top to the bottom. And there we go. Now, if there's a lot of ridges and things like that, you can use one of the metal rib tools to scrape away this surface. But let's put the foot in. So what I'm going to do is, using this narrower portion of the loop tool, I'm going to start in the middle. Some people start on the outside, but I like starting in the middle. And I'm going to work towards the outer edge. And this is going to be my foot right here. It might be a good idea actually to draw in a line where you want the foot to be. So you want it maybe that thickness. So I'm gonna make sure my tool doesn't go beyond that line there. Okay, so again, starting in the middle, I'm gonna work over to the right. I'm just gonna place the corner in, and don't try to take too much out at once. Just slowly moving along, creating this big spiral of clay right to that line there. There we go. So that's my first pass. I'll do this again. So this is where it's important to know the thickness of the base, because you don't want to end up going right through the bottom, and it happens a lot. Tap it to see if, sometimes you can tell how thin it is when you tap it like this. I was only about a centimeter, so I was pretty thin to begin with. So I'm not going to take too much off here. So now I'm flattening out the base. I'm putting this edge against the bottom and just making it look nice. Okay, let's see how that looks. Oops. Okay, that's pretty wide for a foot, so I'm going to trim down the outer edge here. See what I can do. There, I kind of like that shape because it's kind of recessed underneath. So it's a little bit hidden. It's going to take a little bit more clay off the inside here. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. I think that's good enough. Your very last step is to sign the bottom. And this is very important because all of these tend to look the same. And if you've got your name on it, well, that's proof that it's yours. So very important to do this. Now, if you really wanted to do some more trimming on the top, you can do the same thing. You just have to turn the bowl over and center it again. So just remove these. These come away. So we can reuse it. Oops. Okay, so let's try. Okay, so using light, it appears to be the exact same size as one of these lights, which is nice. So it's the center. That's like your bowl has worked. This technique, will be that accurate. In fact, most times you'll find some discrepancy on top here. Will be perfectly round, whereas the bottom of the base, is usually a lot more round because it's base and it has a move around reflex. Okay, but we can still try to get rid of some of these lines, trim some of the base here. So I've also got this smaller loop tool, just for some more detailed work. And I can see how this loop, or this circle, is actually kind of oval. So in this case, I'm just going to have to sort of go with that shape. And I'm just working very gently. Trying to apply sort of consistent pressure the whole time. Wow, it's very warped actually. Part of that was when I picked it up and took it off the wheel, it flexed a lot. Fortunately, there's nothing I can really do about that now, since it is so dry. Okay, so that's about all the trimming I'm going to do this side. If you want to get rid of these lines, if you still see a lot of these lines present, I would wait till the clay becomes dry and then take some sandpaper to it and get it nice and smooth. You don't want to sand it or try sanding it after it's been fired because it's just way too hard. It's actually quite easy to sand when it's just in that dry stage. So there we go. Now there's one more thing you can do with this to make sure that this foot doesn't scratch up a table. You can burnish it and smooth it out. So some people use like a smooth stone, or you can also just use the back of a spoon and just go over this foot and the corners. And you can see how the clay is getting slightly darker in color. So you can feel it. That's going to be super smooth. So that's what's called burnishing. There we go.